Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been a police officer for about 8 years now, and I got into this line of work because I wanted to make a real difference in my community. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, I saw how crime could tear families apart. My own little brother got mixed up with the wrong crowd when he was 16, and it took years to get his life back on track. That experience taught me that sometimes people just need someone to believe in them, but other times they need firm boundaries. I joined the force because I wanted to be both, the person who gives second chances and the one who makes sure actions have meaning. The day that changed everything started like any other Tuesday morning. I was driving through Maple Heights, one of the quieter residential areas in our district. These neighborhoods usually don't see much action beyond the occasional noise complaint or lost pet call. I was actually enjoying the peaceful drive when my radio crackled to life. The dispatcher reported a possible burglary in progress at 1247 Oak Street. A neighbor had called in suspicious activity around the back of the house, and the homeowner was confirmed to be out of town. I responded immediately, telling dispatch I was 2 minutes away. I flipped on my lights and headed straight there. When I arrived at the address, I immediately spotted a woman at the back of the house. She was crouched by a window, definitely trying to pry it open with what looked like a credit card. What struck me as odd was her appearance. She was wearing an expensive-looking navy blazer, perfectly styled blonde hair, and heels that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Not exactly your typical burglar outfit. I parked quietly and approached on foot, wanting to get a better read on the situation before making contact. I called out to her politely, asking what she was doing. She spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. For a split second, I saw genuine shock cross her face, but it quickly changed into something much uglier, pure indignation. She demanded to know who I was, to question her, and asked if I knew who she was. Her voice had this sharp, condescending tone that immediately put me on alert. I dealt with plenty of people who thought their social status made them above the law. I identified myself as an officer and explained that she was attempting to break into a house. I told her she needed to step away from the window and put her hands where I could see them. Instead of complying, she actually rolled her eyes at me. She claimed this was clearly a misunderstanding and said she knew the homeowner very well. She insisted she was just there to pick up some things while the owner was away. I reminded her that the homeowner was currently out of town and that we had received a call about suspicious activity. I asked if she had permission to be there. I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with a believable story. Her eyes kept darting between me and the street like she was calculating her options. She insisted she had permission and claimed the homeowner had asked her to water plants and collect mail. She called the situation ridiculous and said I had no right to detain her over something so innocent. I told her that if her story was true, we could easily clear things up. I explained that I needed her to come with me so we could contact the homeowner and verify everything. That's when her whole demeanor shifted. The fake politeness disappeared completely. She asked if I was kidding and said she wasn't going anywhere with me. She claimed she had important things to do and accused me of harassment. I explained that this wasn't harassment and that since she was attempting to break into a house, I needed to investigate. I instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. What happened next caught me completely off guard. Instead of complying or even continuing to argue, she suddenly lunged forward and shoved me hard in the chest. The force of it, combined with the fact that I wasn't expecting physical resistance, sent me stumbling backward. I fought to regain my balance, but she was already running. And let me tell you, watching someone sprint in 4-inch heels is something you don't forget. The sound of those stilettos hitting the pavement was like a frantic drum beat when she took off down the street. I radioed for backup, reporting that the suspect was fleeing on foot eastbound on Oak Street. Dispatch confirmed that units were on their way. The chase was on. I took off after her, and despite her head start and my initial shock, I was gaining ground quickly. She might have been motivated by desperation, but I run 5 miles every morning, and train regularly. Still, I had to give her credit. She was moving faster than I thought possible in those shoes. When we ran through the neighborhood, she kept shouting over her shoulder that I couldn't catch her and that she was too important for this. She yelled that her husband would have my badge. People were starting to come out of their houses to see what all the commotion was about. I saw an elderly man watering his garden stop and stare, and a woman loading groceries into her car pulled out her phone, probably filming the whole thing. About 3 blocks into the chase, she tried to flag down a taxi that was stopped at a red light. She ran up to the driver's window, frantically knocking on the glass. She screamed at the driver for help, claiming this was police brutality and demanding that he drive her away immediately. The taxi driver took one look at her panicked face, then saw me approaching in full uniform, and promptly drove off when the light turned green. The look of disbelief on her face was almost comical. She was starting to slow down now. I could hear her breathing becoming labored, and her perfect hair was starting to come undone. In a desperate move, she grabbed a garbage can from someone's driveway and pushed it into my path. I managed to dodge it, but it gave her just enough time to gain a little distance. She turned into an alley between 2 houses, and I followed carefully. This could easily be a trap. Maybe she had a weapon or was planning to ambush me. But when I rounded the corner, there she was, trapped at the dead end with her back against a tall wooden fence. Her clothes were now stained with sweat and dirt, her hair was a mess, and she was breathing so hard she could barely speak. I told her it was the end of the line and instructed her to put her hands behind her back. She screamed that I would regret this and that her husband was one of the top lawyers in the city. She threatened that he would destroy my career and claimed she knew the mayor personally. I explained that it didn't matter who she knew or who her husband was. She had broken the law and there were results for that. Just then, my backup arrived, 2 officers who immediately helped me secure her. When we were putting her in handcuffs, she was still ranting about her connections and how we'd all be sorry. Later, when we ran her information, we discovered this wasn't her first offense. She had 2 previous arrests for theft and 1 for assault. Apparently, she had a pattern of using her social status to intimidate people and thinking she could talk her way out of anything. The homeowner confirmed she had never given this woman permission to be on her property. In fact, they'd never even met. During the investigation, we learned she'd been targeting houses in upscale neighborhoods when the owners were away, banking on the fact that if caught, people would assume someone dressed like her belonged there. She ended up pleading guilty to attempted burglary, assault on a police officer, and resisting arrest. Her fancy lawyer husband couldn't save her from a 6-month jail sentence and community service. The last I heard, she was picking up trash on the highway in an orange jumpsuit, a far cry from her designer wardrobe. I never really knew my stepdad during his military days. By the time my mom and I came into his life, he was just a laid-back guy who loved cooking Chinese food and playing flight simulators on his computer. But when he told this story, you could see the old fire still burning in his eyes, even decades later. It was 1968, maybe 1969, right in the thick of the Vietnam War. My stepdad had just been transferred to Treasure Island Naval Station in San Francisco. He was young then, maybe in his early 20s, and had been in the Navy for a few years already. The base was a major processing point for sailors heading to and from Vietnam, so it was always bustling with nervous recruits and battle-worn veterans. My stepdad was the kind of guy who noticed things. He had this habit of carrying a camera everywhere he went, the same one I have now actually. It's one of my most treasured possessions. He started noticing some disturbing patterns around the base. There was this group of higher-ranking military personnel who seemed to take a special interest in the young recruits who were about to ship out to Vietnam. These kids were scared, homesick, and desperate for any kind of friendship or guidance. What my stepdad discovered made his blood boil. These predators, led by a guy I'll call the antagonist since that's what he was, were systematically targeting these vulnerable recruits. They'd befriend them, gain their trust, then get them drunk and shoot them up with heroin. While the kids were unconscious, they'd take compromising photographs, Then they'd use those photos to blackmail the recruits into smuggling drugs. I don't know exactly how my stepdad found out about this operation, but when he did, he went through all the proper channels. He reported it to his superiors, filed the paperwork, did everything by the book, but nothing happened. The higher-ups were too busy dealing with the war to care about what they probably saw as a minor disciplinary issue. My stepdad wasn't the type to let injustice slide. He started following these guys around, trying to intervene whenever he could. If he saw them approaching a vulnerable recruit, he'd find a way to interrupt. If they were trying to get someone alone, he'd show up with some excuse about needing that person for duty. The antagonist hated this interference. He was a manipulative piece of work who thrived on having power over others. Having some lower-ranking sailor constantly ruining his operations drove him crazy. So he started pushing back, trying to get my stepdad in trouble, hoping to get him court-martialed and out of the way. But my stepdad was smart. He kept his nose clean and never gave the antagonist anything concrete to use against him. Meanwhile, he was building his case. He took detailed notes about everything: dates, times, locations, who was involved. And most importantly, he started taking photographs. One day, the antagonist cornered my stepdad and told him he needed to mind his own business because he was playing with fire. My stepdad said that he was exactly where he needed to be. The antagonist warned him that interfering with official business would get him in serious trouble. My stepdad shot back that he was about to say the same thing to the antagonist. This went on for months. My stepdad would intervene, the antagonist would threaten him, and the dance would continue. But my stepdad was patient. He knew he needed ironclad evidence before he could take down someone with that much rank and influence. After what must have been a couple of years, my stepdad had everything he needed. Photographs of the drug operation, detailed logs of their activities, witness statements from some of the victims he'd helped. It was enough to destroy the antagonist completely. But then something happened that changed everything. My stepdad had been in the Navy for almost 10 years at this point and had worked his way up the ranks. He was dating a woman who lived off base, and when it came time for her to move, he made a decision that would come back to haunt him. He used his position to get some lower-ranking personnel to help move her belongings. Maybe used a military vehicle in the process. It wasn't a big deal, everyone did stuff like that and most people looked the other way. But the antagonist found out. The antagonist walked up to my stepdad with a smug grin and mentioned that he'd heard my stepdad had been playing moving company with military resources. When my stepdad asked what his point was, the antagonist explained that misusing military personnel and equipment was a court-martial offense. My stepdad pointed out that half the base did the same thing. The antagonist smugly replied that half the base wasn't constantly sticking their nose where it didn't belong. Within a week, my stepdad was facing a court-martial. The antagonist had filed a formal complaint, and unlike my stepdad's reports about the drug operation, this one was taken seriously. My stepdad was found guilty and demoted 2 full ranks. That's when something changed in my stepdad. The injustice of it, being punished for a minor infraction while watching serious criminals operate with impunity, created a rage in him that ran deeper than anything he'd felt before. But instead of lashing out, he got calculating. He decided to wait. My stepdad kept his evidence locked away and watched while the antagonist continued climbing the ranks. Year after year, the antagonist got promoted, gained more power, more influence, and year after year, my stepdad worked to rebuild his own career, fighting against the antagonists behind the scenes, sabotage at every step. The antagonist would whisper negative things about my stepdad during promotion reviews, telling other officers that he had attitude problems, couldn't follow orders properly, and wasn't leadership material. Other officers started noticing that my stepdad seemed stuck, unable to advance despite his obvious competence. But my stepdad endured it all, biding his time. For 10 years, he watched the antagonist rise higher and higher, reaching the absolute peak of his naval career. The antagonist had everything he'd ever wanted: respect, authority, a pension waiting for him. He was untouchable. That's when my stepdad struck. He pulled out every piece of evidence he'd been saving for a decade. The photographs, the detailed logs, testimonies from victims who were now willing to speak up. He presented it all in one devastating package that painted a complete picture of the antagonist's crimes. The court martial was swift and brutal. The antagonist tried to fight it, tried to use his influence, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was dishonorably discharged, stripped of all rank and benefits, and sent to prison. A year later, with the antagonist's sabotage removed, my stepdad was promoted to Master Chief Petty Officer. He spent the rest of his 30-year career at that rank, retiring in the early 90s as one of the most respected sailors on the base. I asked my mom once if he ever regretted waiting so long, letting the antagonist hurt more people while he bided his time. She told me she'd asked him the same thing, and he'd explained his reasoning. He said if he'd taken the antagonist down early, the man would have served a few years and gotten out with some benefits intact. By waiting until he had everything to lose, my stepdad made sure the fall was complete. The antagonist lost 30 years of career advancement, his pension, his reputation, everything. My stepdad passed away when I was 18, and I never got to hear these stories directly from him. But according to my mom, even decades later when he told the story, you could see the old anger flicker back to life in his eyes. Not because he regretted what he did, but because some injustices burn so deep they never really heal. He saved a lot of young sailors from a terrible fate, and he made sure the man who preyed on them paid the ultimate price for his crimes. I lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business, and my grandmother was the unofficial watchdog of our street. She had raised 5 kids of her own and wasn't about to let anyone mess with her family, especially when it came to my uncle, who was the youngest at 15. My grandmother had always been protective, but she became extra vigilant after my grandfather started working double shifts at the factory. With him gone most evenings, she felt like she had to keep an even closer eye on things. My uncle was a good kid for the most part, but he was also 15 and starting to test boundaries like any teenager would. The whole thing started on a hot Saturday night in August. My grandmother had sent my uncle to pick up some groceries from the corner store, but when he came back 3 hours later, stumbling slightly and smelling like beer, she knew something was wrong. She didn't say anything that night, but she started paying closer attention to where he was going and who he was hanging around with. A few days later, she decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to see what was happening at the little pizza shop that had opened up about 6 months earlier. The place was always packed with teenagers, which seemed odd for a pizza joint that barely had decent food. When she got closer to the building, she could see through the windows that kids were clearly drinking beer inside, and these weren't 18 or 19-year-olds. These were kids who looked barely old enough for high school. That Saturday night, she waited until the pizza shop was at its busiest and walked right through the front door. The place was packed with teenagers, and sure enough, most of them had beer bottles in their hands. My grandmother walked straight up to the counter where the owner was taking orders. She told him she needed to speak with him about selling alcohol to minors, specifically her 15-year-old nephew. The owner barely looked up from the cash register and said he didn't know what she was talking about, claiming they only served pizza there. My grandmother didn't buy his act for a second. She pointed out that she could see exactly what was happening and that he was selling beer to children, demanding that it stop immediately. The owner finally looked at her with an unfriendly expression and told her it was his business and he could do whatever he wanted. He gestured toward the exit dismissively. My grandmother warned him that if she found out he had sold even one more beer to her nephew or any other kid in the neighborhood, it would be the end of his days there. The owner actually laughed at her and asked if she was threatening him. He told her to get out of his store before he called the cops. He came around the counter and practically pushed her toward the door, telling her she wasn't welcome there anymore and to never come back. When my grandmother was being shoved out, she turned back and reminded him that she had warned him and this wasn't over. When she got home that night, she was angrier than I'd ever seen her, but she didn't immediately do anything about it, which surprised me because my grandmother wasn't usually one to let things slide. About a month later, she was cleaning my uncle's room and found 3 empty beer bottles under his bed. She confronted him immediately about where they came from. My uncle tried to deny knowing anything about them at first, but when my grandmother pressed him about whether he got them from the pizza place, he finally admitted the truth. He told her that yes, the owner had been selling beer to him and pretty much any kid who had money. According to my uncle, the guy was making a fortune because he was selling to kids who were only 8 years old, and he would even open up the back door after hours to sell beer when the shop was officially closed. My uncle explained that the owner had told all the kids not to tell their parents because they wouldn't understand, claiming the kids were mature enough to handle drinking. My grandmother was furious, but she kept her voice calm when she asked how many other kids were buying beer from him. My uncle admitted that pretty much everyone he knew was getting beer from the pizza shop owner, who didn't care how old anyone was if they had money to pay. That's when my grandmother started making phone calls to other mothers in the neighborhood. She discovered that several parents had found beer in their kids' rooms or smelled alcohol on them, but most hadn't connected it to the pizza shop. My grandfather went to the police station to file a complaint, but they basically brushed him off. The officer told him they would take a report and look into it, but unless they caught the owner in the act, there wasn't much they could do since it was one person's word against another. When my grandfather came home and told my grandmother what the police had said, she just nodded and said they would handle it themselves. She made my uncle promise to never go back to that pizza shop again. She told him she didn't care if his friends were going there or if they thought he was uncool, but he needed to stay away from that place because bad things were going to happen there. When my uncle asked what kind of bad things, my grandmother simply said the kind he didn't want to be around for. Months went by. August turned into September, then October, November, and winter came and went. I started to think my grandmother had forgotten about the whole thing or decided to let it go. But I should have known better. My grandmother never forgot anything, and she definitely never let anything go. The following July, I was staying over at my grandparents' house when we heard this incredible crashing sound coming from down the street. It was after 12 o'clock a.m., and everyone came running outside to see what had happened. A snowplow had driven straight into the front of the pizza shop, completely destroying the storefront. The crazy part was that it was the middle of summer, so seeing a snowplow at all was weird. But seeing one that had clearly just smashed into a building was absolutely bizarre. The neighbors who had been sitting on their front steps trying to escape the heat said they watched the whole thing happen. They described how the snowplow had driven down the street, slammed into the shop, backed up, hit it again, then backed up and hit it one more time before driving away like nothing had happened. One neighbor kept saying it was the strangest thing she had ever seen, wondering who uses a snowplow in July. When the police arrived, they couldn't make sense of what had happened either. One officer asked the witnesses if they were sure it was a snowplow, suggesting maybe it was just a large truck. The neighbor insisted it was definitely a snowplow with a big plate on the front and everything. The next morning, the damage was even more obvious. The entire front of the building was destroyed, and there was no way the pizza shop could reopen without major repairs. When we walked past the wreckage, my grandmother had a small smile on her face and commented that it was quite a shame with obvious sarcasm in her voice. I noticed that several of the other mothers from the neighborhood had also come to look at the damage, and they all had similar expressions. Nobody seemed particularly upset about what had happened. Within a week, there was a for rent sign in the window. The owner couldn't afford to rebuild because he hadn't had proper insurance coverage. All that money he'd made selling beer to kids hadn't been enough to cover the cost of fixing his business. It wasn't until years later that my uncle told me the real story. My grandmother had found someone who needed money and was willing to help solve her problem. This person happened to know someone who had access to the county snowplows. The rest was just a matter of timing and opportunity. The pizza shop owner disappeared from the neighborhood completely. Nobody ever saw him again, and nobody seemed to miss him. The building eventually became a legitimate family restaurant that actually served good food and followed all the laws. My grandmother never directly admitted to orchestrating the whole thing, but she didn't deny it either. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.